Hi there, and thanks for tuning into the Explaining History YouTube channel. Now, if you're watching this, it's probably because you're doing something about Stalin's foreign policy and the start of the Second World War. So very quickly, I'm going to take you through the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, or the Nazi-Soviet Pact, as it is, and how it comes about. Now, in August 1939, people in the Soviet Union, in Germany, and particularly in the West, was stunned by the revelation that Stalin had signed a deal with Hitler. The Nazi movement, and Hitler in particular, had spent many years decrying Soviet communism. Hitler had made no secret of his desire for Lebensraum in the Soviet Union, for living space, to conquer the Soviet Union. And Stalin had spent much of the 1930s obsessed with the fear of Hitler. The historian Timothy Snyder makes a point in his book Bloodlands that many of Stalin's purges were Stalin's own particular take on preparing the Soviet Union for war with Nazi Germany. Stalin believed that had an obsessional fear of traitors within, and him and Beria and Yezhov and Yagoda all believed that it was their job really to root out the fifth columnists, the traitors, who would rise up and ally themselves with the enemy inevitably when the attack on the Soviet Union came from Europe. So Stalin had his eye on Poland, Germany and Japan as the three great potential threats. And whilst this might sound wildly paranoid, and it certainly is, the entire culture of Soviet communism is deeply suspicious and fearful of external saboteurs, enemies, and the assumption is that the moment a revolution happens, then there will immediately be some sort of attempt to undo it. But you see, there had been an Allied intervention in Russia during the Russian Civil War, in order really to undo the revolution. Winston Churchill said, Bolshevism must be strangled in its crib. So it wasn't that paranoid of Stalin. When Stalin looked at the Ukrainian famines, he believed that part of the trouble with the kulaks had been stirred up by the Poles. The Poles had, in 1920, attempted to annex part of the Ukraine, and the Ukraine itself is such a valuable asset as a huge food producing area. And Stalin was convinced that foreign troublemakers were infiltrating the Soviet Union, and that it would be the Poland would either be a conduit for the Germans or would join with the Germans in an invasion of the Soviet Union. So Stalin looked constantly to foreign threats overseas, and as the international climate from 1933 changes, and Stalin becomes more aware of the threat of Germany, he looks at what Britain and France are prepared to do. He toys with the thought that an alliance of convenience between Britain and France in the West and the Soviet Union in the East might be viable, and then he notices that the British signed the Anglo-German Naval Agreement in 1935, that the French and the British seem divided, and the Hoare-Laval Pact of 1935 absolves Mussolini to a greater extent in his behaviour in Abyssinia. Stalin then notices in 1936 that the British and the French are unwilling to get behind the Spanish Republic and preserve it from its onslaught against fascism, even though Stalin is sending troops and equipment to fight for Spain. Stalin actually, incidentally, on the subject of Spain, didn't necessarily want to see a socialist government emerge in Spain. He actually particularly didn't want that. He didn't like the idea of what could potentially be a social democratic government emerging in Spain. that was a real threat to Stalinist orthodoxy. He simply wanted to keep the war in Spain going for long enough to draw Germany in for long enough so that Hitler could become bogged down in Spain, a sort of like a Vietnam for Hitler, if you will. Don't want to kind of muddle analogies there. But it's at Munich in 1938 that Stalin really decides that he can't rely on the West. In 1938, at the Munich Agreement, the Sudetenland is apportioned to Germany. The Czechs are not consulted. They're simply told by the British and the French, you better take this deal because it only gets worse from here and we cannot intervene to help you. Stalin isn't invited to the meeting, even though that he has a defensive pact with Czechoslovakia. And it's at that point that Stalin says, well, they're going to make a deal with Hitler. I can see it happening. They will make a deal with Hitler so there won't be a war in the West. If there is no war in the West, then the war in the East that's inevitable will come sooner rather than later. So I will make a deal with Hitler. I will make a deal with Hitler, and the West will wind up getting the war first, not me. This could work out to Stalin's advantage. If the West is at war, the fighting will happen in France. Hitler hopefully will get bogged down there as the German army in the First World War did, and it will be 3 or 4 years before there's any resolution. Western Europe will be devastated again, and it will be rich pickings for a Red Army which will now have been reinvigorated after Stalin's purges of the Red Army, and the Red Army might all be able to march to the English Channel conceivably. These were some of the strategic thinking that Stalin had. The law for that Stalin had for Hitler, the appeal, was resources. Stalin thought that he could offer Hitler resources. He believed that he had a Marxist interpretation of Nazism. He said all this sort of anti-Semitism, racist nonsense, that's not really what Nazism is all about. Nazism is simply the attack dog that capitalism has created in order to deal with the threat of communism. And so what we need to do is speak not to the Nazis, but to the capitalists behind them. If we offer them lots of nice resources from the Soviet Union, oil, manganese, timber, all these sorts of things, then they will realise they're getting these things at such a bargain, which is what these capitalists want, that they won't need to invade the Soviet Union because they'll be getting everything they need. Fatal miscalculation, because Nazism can't be explained in this way. Nazism is a specifically racial doctrine. There may well have been capitalists, capitalist forces behind Nazism, but not really with the degree of power, and ideological or economic power that Stalin presumed existed at all. And this is why an invasion in 1941 happens anyway. The obvious other thing to mention is the secret part of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which enables Poland to be partitioned. Poland was a country that the Nazis did not even consider to be a proper country. They thought it was a kind of a historical fiction, and should simply be erased from the map. Stalin simply saw it as a threat, a danger on his border that needed to be eliminated. Thanks, I hope you found that useful, and I'll catch you on the next video. Oh, subscribe, by the way, and say nice things about this video. Give us lots of comments and, that kind of thing.